Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm so delighted that you're here with us today. My name is Anne Marie Hunter. I am the director of Safe Havens Interfaith Partnership Against Domestic Violence and Elder Abuse. And I am just delighted that you've joined us. A few words about Safe Havens. We are interfaith, multi religious, founded in 1991. We work both locally and nationally. And our mission is to bring together faith communities and domestic and sexual violence advocates to figure out how to partner and work with each other so that faith leaders can be referring to advocates and we can work together to support the very complex needs of faith-based clients and survivors. So that's what we're all about. And I want to thank also OVW for funding this work. And I'd just like to point out to any of you who are faith leaders on the call that the reason they do is we all know how important it is to engage the faith community in order to end abuse and help survivors find healing and justice. So important that OVW sees that as well and is funding this project, and we're deeply grateful. So there are a few webinars in this series, and I think there's a slide with the webinars.
At the end.
Oh, not till the end. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so there are upcoming webinars, which I will tell you about at the very end. So stay tuned for that. You'll definitely want to be part of those as well. They're all really, really interesting. So without anything other verbiage than that, I just want to introduce you to my esteemed colleague that it has been a huge privilege to work with for many years. Allison Morse Katzman is Safe Havens' associate director. We have worked together for a number of years. She is also a member of the Jewish community in the Boston area and a master's in public administration, has a long history in community organizing and awareness raising and all of that justice work. So Allison, please help us understand domestic violence through a Jewish lens.
I would be honored to, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I have to say, this is so weird to not to be talking to a group of people and not being able to see your faces. So if you would be kind enough to let me know who is on the call and the community that you're representing, and maybe your agency, or if you're faith or if you're faith affiliated, I would love to see that in the chat if you don't mind. And I'll get to look at it periodically. Today we're going to talk about what we might need to know to better support victims or people who are experiencing abuse who identify as being Jewish. What can we learn today about the Jewish religion and traditions that might give us some insight? And I want to point out that when Safe Havens talks about different faiths, first of all, we don't expect anyone to be experts on faith. I mean, certainly not advocates, but this is important information to have, because we're always talking about being culturally relevant. And we really do think that understanding someone's faith is part of being culturally relevant or culturally humble, or however you want to put it. So I hope I'm talking to some people, because no one put their name in the chat. So maybe you'll put something in the chat for this. Have you ever served any Jewish survivors? Please let me know. And if you have or haven't, do you know Jewish clergy? And have you worked with Jewish clergy or Jewish professional organizations? Or have you been connected to synagogues in any way? If you would include that in the chat as well. And I'll give you a second for that. So far, it doesn't look like anyone has worked with Jewish survivors or victims. And in some ways, I'm not surprised. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So let's get into Judaism in America. I'm just going to quickly explain these pictures to you. Many of you may know what these pictures are, but many may not. On the top left, or as you're looking at your screen, there is a loaf of bread that is called challah. It's an egg-based bread. It's delicious. Think of it as like a brioche. In the back, there are some candles and some wine, and that is our setup for our Friday night, when we welcome the Sabbath. Our Sabbath starts on Friday night at sundown and goes until Saturday evening at sundown. And that's how we welcome the Sabbath. We say a prayer over the candles, and then we say a blessing over the wine and over the challah. At 12 o'clock is a picture of a prayer book and a kippah, a men's yarmulke, which you may have heard. It's not a requirement, but in many synagogues, men will cover their head as a sign of respect. The picture on the right is pictures of honey, apples, and a shofar, which is supposed to be a ram's horn. That's symbols of our Jewish New Year, which usually is in the early fall, and then the Jewish star. So let's talk about Jewish demographics in America. The information about the population. So there are about 7.6 million Jewish people, which is about 2.4% of the United States population. And Judaism is not defined solely by faith tradition, but also by ancestry and culture. Some people will identify as Jewish without stating that their religion is Jewish. They may be what we might call cultural Jews, and we'll talk more about that later. Some other demographic information. Jewish people are more educated. As a matter of fact, they are twice as likely to have a college degree than the rest of the United States population, and more likely to live in urban or metropolitan areas. The Jewish population is also older compared to the United States population. About 49% of the Jewish population in the United States is 55 and older. So, who are American Jews? How a person labels themselves, first of all, doesn't always indicate the person's practice or level of observance. You can see here that we have, these are the basic categories or denominations, excuse me, of Judaism: Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. Initially, back in the before the 1700s and back in the day of the Old Testament, everyone was Orthodox. There was only one form of Judaism. But in the 1700s in Germany, there were changes made to make it easier for Jews to live within modern society. And that Reform Judaism came to the United States in the mid-1800s. Conservative Judaism came out of a tension between the Reform and the Orthodox. It kind of takes some more of the Orthodox traditions and aren't quite as liberal leaning or as the Reform communities. The non-affiliated and cultural Jews, you can see, comprise most of the people who consider themselves American Jews. And just for your information, in Israel, there is not, being a Reform or conservative Jewish person is not as big a thing as it is in the United States. In Israel, it's usually you're either secular or you're Orthodox. So some basics of Judaism. Our clergy are called either rabbis or cantors. Rabbis usually lead the congregation. Cantors are tasked with, they can lead the congregation, but also they focus on the chanting and the singing that goes along in the service. Our Holy Scripture is called the Torah, and the Torah is the whole of the laws given by God to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. Jews follow these laws, and those laws govern daily life. And within the Torah, there are 613 commandments. Most of them, or not most of them, but many of them have to do with sacrifices, which obviously don't happen today. Orthodox Jewish people practice all the commandments that don't have anything to do with the sacrifices, while conservative and Reform Jews have interpreted the Torah for modern life. For people who aren't Jewish, you might know the Torah as the Old Testament. The rabbis wrote the Torah, and they wrote a lot of legal books. The rabbis wrote legal books after the Torah to determine the law as it applies to life in each new place and time. And there's lots of study of that, and we won't get into that. That's more than you need to know. House of worship, we worship at a synagogue or a temple. If you are in a more Orthodox community, people might call it a shul, which is Yiddish for synagogue. That's a Yiddish word. So some of the basics of Judaism. A big part of being Jewish has to do with how you act. And that is really important. Acting with honor, or kavod, showing dignity and respect for others. Saving a life is incredibly important. It could be your own or someone else, and that comes before all other commandments. Not standing by while your neighbor bleeds. And some of you may have heard of this idea of repairing the world, or tikkun olam. It has come to mean very broadly social justice, that it's a person's responsibility for fixing what is wrong, but what's wrong with the world, but it should be just part of your everyday existence if you're following some of the basic tenets of Judaism. It's not just something that you do on a Sunday during Sunday school. So no questions so far. I guess that's good. Abuse in the Jewish community. That's what we're here to talk about, really. Abuse in the Jewish community occurs at the same rate as in other faiths, and it occurs across all denominations. I know that when I first started this work, people would say to me, well, it only occurs in the Orthodox denominations, the more conservative communities. And those conservative and Orthodox communities would say, oh, no, it occurs in the Reform communities because they don't, they're all over the place on their gender roles, and it occurs everywhere. And it's really very difficult for Jewish people to seek help. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So abuse through a Jewish lens, what might that look like? It's basically spiritual abuse. I mean, abuse is abuse, and there are different forms of abuse. We can talk about, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the word, but we can talk about financial abuse, and we can talk about emotional abuse, and we can talk about spiritual abuse, and there are lots of, they kind of all cross over. But talking about abuse through a Jewish lens, one way could be forcing a certain level of observance. It could be disrupting home-based ceremonies and rituals. Like much of the Jewish traditions are home-based. And so on Friday night, when you light the Sabbath candles, maybe the abuser doesn't let you light those Sabbath candles. Or maybe if you're in a more conservative community and you participate in the Sabbath without turning on electricity, maybe the abuser will make it so that you have to turn on the electricity, or you can't turn on you can't leave it on, because that's something that some people will do to avoid having to touch the electricity during the Sabbath. Disrespecting a kosher kitchen. Kosher means legal, but a kosher kitchen, there are laws and guidelines for what you can and cannot eat, and certain reasons why. And someone who keeps kosher, it would be pretty easy to disrupt that. It would be very easy for an abuser to come in and bring in something that is not kosher into the kitchen, or to purposely mix up the plates. In a kosher kitchen, you have separate plates for meat and separate plates for dairy. That would be pretty easy to mess up. And then Nida and the mikvah. A mikvah is a ritual bath that men and women use, but women use it after they have menstruated and they are no longer in a state of nida. Nida are the laws of separation. Women and men in Orthodox communities, people who use a mikvah, don't touch in any way, and they go to the mikvah. It would be very easy for an abuser to prevent someone from getting to the mikvah, whether it was be through forbidding the person to leave or to come home. There are lots of ways, just like there are lots of ways for any abuser to take anything, whether it's faith-based or otherwise, and use it as a weapon against someone. More abuse through a Jewish lens, divorce. Divorce is a big one. So a get is a Jewish divorce. It is a religious divorce. It is not civil. And a husband has to, in Judaism, a husband has to present to the wife the get, the Jewish divorce, to effectuate the divorce. And there are lots of problems around not getting a get. It used to be a joke when my father talked about not getting a get from his much earlier marriage. And we used to joke about it, but it is definitely not a joke. For someone who can't get a get, for a woman who can't get a get, she becomes chained to the marriage. She becomes an aguna because her husband refuses to give her that divorce. If she did get a divorce, a civil marriage, a civil divorce, the marriage could be dissolved under the state law. But in Judaism, that person would still be, they would be still married under Jewish law until the husband presents the wife with this bill of Jewish divorce. In some cases, men will use this as another tool or another weapon to manipulate and control the person. Men will refuse to grant the get out of spite or a desire to exert control over their ex-wives, or use it as a bargaining chip in financial or custodial negotiations. Women who remarry and have children without first receiving a get are considered to be adulterers under Jewish law. Now, this doesn't matter in all cases. There are plenty of people in the United States who don't bother to get a get. But if you live in a community where there are lots of Orthodox people will talk about you. There's a lot of shame around this. Women who have had children this way, their children are considered illegitimate under Jewish law, and they may themselves be declared ineligible to marry, should they seek to marry under Orthodox auspices, or in the state of Israel, where the Orthodox rabbinate determines who's eligible to marry. Women may also refuse to receive a get, but the consequences are not nearly as serious, and Jewish law provides options to end the marriage without her consent should she persist in her refusal. Now, it's very patriarchal. There is no question about that, and there are changes being made, but I'm just mentioning here kind of the most extreme situation. The manipulation of Jewish law in the divorce process is a form, like I said, of domestic abuse, whose primary victims are women and children in the Jewish community. And this abuse often contributes to their impoverishment after divorce. Get refusal, it's not just an Orthodox issue. It can affect every segment in our Jewish community if you are concerned about continuing to live a Jewish life. People will want to remarry, who want to remarry in a conservative synagogue in the United States, in the state of Israel, will still need that get. And women sometimes wait years for some kind of solution. They're chained to their marriages that are no longer viable. And it really is an ultimate power play for the abusers. I see, can a rabbi give the get to the woman if the man refuses when it's a DV situation? That's a really good question, and thank you for asking that. I honestly don't know the exact answer to that question. I know that there have, in an Orthodox, it would have to be in an very Orthodox situation when this happens. There's an organization that helps women who need to get a get, and they will intervene on behalf of the person who's the woman who's trying to get the get. And so there have been lots of ways that rabbis are coerced into making sure that the abuser will do what he needs to do. In this case, it's a man, do what he needs to do. And I've heard stories where communities in the Jewish community, Orthodox Jewish communities, the women who are supporting the person who's trying to get the get will no longer go to the mikveh, and which means there cannot be relations between between their partner as partners. And so men will pressure the abuser to make sure that this happens. So there is a lot of community involvement at times, which is that's not such an easy thing either. Okay, any other questions? Let's move on. Judaism as a barrier for survivors of abuse. Many of these barriers are the same in other communities, faith communities, cultural communities. I mean, all communities deal with denial. And then that happens in the Jewish community. The Jewish community says, "Oh, not in our community. We don't have domestic violence in our community." And we know, and actually, our partners at a Journey to Safety here in the Greater Boston area and Safe Havens, we did a little research study several years ago that we went to 15 Jewish clergy in the Greater Boston area, and we talked to them about domestic violence and what is happening in their community. And every single one of them says, "Oh, no, this isn't happening in our community. No one's coming to us with talk to us about abuse." And then we talk to them more, educating them more about the insidiousness of the manipulation and feeling unsafe and feeling controlled. And every single one of those Jewish clergy thought back on it and said, "Oh, wait a minute, maybe people have come to me about this topic and I just didn't understand it," because they obviously, as you all know, people minimize and they sanitize what they say. So there is domestic violence in the Jewish community. There is a lot of family pressure, community pressure that goes along with this. And just like in other communities, in other small communities, in other marginalized communities, there's a lot of pressure. There's also in smaller communities, in the Orthodox community, where everyone knows everyone because it's such a tight-knit community and they don't go outside their community out into the rest of the world. It's even more pressure. Lashon hora, that is speaking ill of someone. People will think that talking about the abuse that you're experiencing would be talking ill of your partner, and that truthfully, that is not speaking ill of someone. That is telling the truth. And we would encourage people to come forward. Shonda, shame, community pressure, it's kind of the same thing. No one wants to air their dirty laundry. There's a lot of male privilege in the Jewish community and more in the more conservative and Orthodox communities. And then Shalom Bayit. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but Shalom Bayit is this idea of a peaceful home. And it has come over the years because in Orthodoxy, and certainly many, many years ago, women were more in charge of the home. And so it seemed like Shalom Bayit was on the shoulders of the woman. And so the cultural understanding that peace in the home is a woman's responsibility is a cultural distortion that the victim ends up being blamed. And really, we have to disrupt that male privilege, because peace in the home is everyone's responsibility, and everyone, people in the Jewish community will understand that. It's not just the woman who can create peace in the home. Telling her to cook a better Sabbath dinner is not going to fix the situation. So stereotypes, and I would like you to all think, and this is okay to think about, and I would love it if you would type it in the chat, but what comes to mind when you think of a stereotypical Jewish man? I will not be offended. There are stereotypes for a reason. So what comes to your mind when you think of a stereotypical Jewish man?
And Allison, while they're typing, just to know that you have another question as well.
Oh.
Ajal says, it seems like the woman has to suffer publicly, no support at all.
A lot of times there is no support. Although I shouldn't say, we'll talk about support. There are ways to get support, and there are lots of wonderful agencies, and we can talk about that. So someone here says in the question and answer, black hat with beard and locks. That's a very Orthodox, stereotypical Jewish man. What do you think of, are Jewish men typically really, are they professional athletes typically? I think of when men strict by the book, that can, yes. I would also say, certainly when I was growing up, nice Jewish boys were not very physical. Nice Jewish boys, businessmen and wealthy, yes, absolutely. Very business-minded, doctors, lawyers. Jewish men make great husbands, a mensch, so kind, a good provider. Overly worried, involved Jewish, yes, Sarah. Overly worried and involved Jewish mother, that women, we'll get to the women, don't worry, I promise. But so nice Jewish men or boys they're nice, and they're not particularly forceful. And sometimes that Jewish mother is the dominant person in that Jewish boy's or Jewish man's life. Jewish men aren't physical. They are not necessarily aggressive. They are known to make great husbands. What about the stereotypical Jewish woman, besides being overly worried and involved? What are some of the other stereotypes about Jewish women? And again, I'm not going to be offended in any way. I know them all, or many of them. Jewish women, are they easy to please? Probably not. Have any of you ever heard of the term Jewish American princess? A Jap. It's a terrible stereotype that they don't want to work hard, that they want to be given everything by the man who is that very that wealthy businessman. They're pushy, submissive. Women are submissive. Pressure to be perfect and follow the book. Yes. I would say that not most Jewish women, the stereotype of Jewish women are that they're pushy and demanding. And you can see that in a lot of older movies, maybe not as many these days. I am thinking of one movie, I'm aging myself, but the movie Crossing Delancey. There is a Jewish woman who is being a matchmaker, and she is so pushy, and demanding and loud and in your face. And that is, to me, when I think of a stereotypical Jewish woman, that is one of them. So let's just talk about stereotypes. We all, nosy matchmakers, harsh. Thank you very much for that. Yes, definitely. Nothing wrong with being a matchmaker, though, as long as you're not pushy or harsh. But we all know what happens when you stereotype people. You're making judgments that may or may not be true, but that people will end up believing. Now, think about the idea of this Jewish woman. If we're making these judgments of a Jewish woman who comes in to our agency and says, and she's pushy, and you can't imagine that she could be possibly being abused by a very meek and educated and wealthy a man who kind of looks up to his mother, and so it makes it hard for us to imagine that this woman could possibly be a victim. And yet Jewish men, even if they are nerdy and meek and whatever, that is definitely, we all know all different kinds of people can be abusive and perpetrate abuse on other people. And so we need to back off on that stereotype. What has been your experience working specifically with Jewish people of color? That's just even more intersections that people have to deal with, and that makes it even more difficult. One of the things, and maybe I'm going to get to this at a certain point, but I'll jump in now, is that we have to, as advocates, and I'm not an advocate, I consider myself part of the faith community and working at Safe Havens, we are very clear that you advocates out there are the experts on this. But one thing that has been hard, we have learned for advocates to address, is finding out where people get their support when it comes to a faith-based situation, like if someone is faith-based. There are a lot of advocates, and I'm not talking about any of you in particular because I don't know you, but we have run across many advocates who are afraid or not to talk about faith for lots of reasons, or they're not interested. Anne-Marie was traveling, I was not on that trip, but Anne-Marie was traveling and came to meet with the advocate that we were working with. And the advocate says, we are so thrilled that you're here. All of our clients are talking about their faith. And Anne-Marie was so excited and says, oh, that's so great. What do you do? And she says, oh, I don't listen. I don't care about that. And if you aren't able to be allow the victim to be a whole person with you, you're missing out on an opportunity to find support. Now, we would say the same thing to the faith leaders. Trust me, we would say to the faith leaders, if you can't talk to these people about the abuse that's going on in their lives, then they are whitewashing an important part of what is going on in their life. And so I think that we need to be able to open up to all the intersections that people are coming to us as they experience the abuse. So let me talk about Judaism as a resource, because there are, just like in all faiths, there are barriers and there are resources. So Pekuah Nefesh, I mentioned earlier the idea of to save a life, including your own. That means foregoing all commandments to take care of yourself. And if that means doing whatever you need to not drown in the situation you are in while you're undergoing the abuse. So if it means that your abuser is not allowing you to keep a kosher kitchen, that's okay, because it's way more important for you to survive the situation and to survive the abuse. Teshuvah, well, dignity and respect, I think that's fairly obvious. And I have up here teshuvah, which is technically means to return to your better or former self. Some people would call it, in Judaism, they would call it forgiveness. But Judaism doesn't talk about like, okay, you can just forgive. There are 4 steps to teshuva. And I like to, I think that it's a great model myself, not just for people who are abusive, but for anything. So you have to abandon the sin or trait or attitude. You have to verbally confess the sin to God. You need to demonstrate shame and regret for having committed the sin or having assumed the sin. And you have to take upon yourself never to do it, think that way, do it again, think that way, act that way. And I would have to say that is I can't say it's Batterer's intervention in a nutshell, but there are lots of aspects of teshuva that the Batterer's intervention programs espouse. So I just realized Anne Marie is saying, Anne Marie, do you want to let me know if there are comments or questions? Because I'm having a hard time seeing the chat box right now.
There's a really interesting question in um, and I think from the about working with Jewish color. She says, or he says,
yes, yes, I see that. Yes, I totally agree. I actually have had this conversation with other people that Judaism, you can hide your Jewishness very easily. I mean, it would be, but you cannot hide the color of your skin. So yes, I think that is way more predominant. But if you're working with a person who is a Black person who is, and there are plenty of Black people who are Jewish, if you're working with them and they talk about their faith, then there's another source of support for that person who's experiencing abuse. So interpreting Jewish traditions surrounding abuse. A lot of times people who, a lot of times people who are observant Jews will want to be close to a place of worship. They'll want to have the ability to keep kosher. So you need to considering that, also considering that when people come into shelter, that might be a way to support people who are experiencing abuse. Marriage, uncomfortable with breaking marriage vows is not unique to Judaism. We all are worried about community disapproval around that. And divorce, without getting a get, the survivor enters this new relationship of being considered an adulteress. And there are plenty of people who do not care, but there are people who will, and you just need to keep that in mind. So other considerations that I think are important to know: Jewish survivors will rarely go to shelter. Jewish survivors will remain in the relationship 5 to 7 years longer than non-Jewish victims. And teens, depending on their level of observance, they may not be allowed to date. And we know what that might mean. They may not be allowed to date. They're told they're not allowed to date, but what they do behind their parents' back is something different. And they may not be, maybe they're allowed to date, but they're not allowed to date non-Jewish people. And I know that this is not, again, this is not just something that happens in the Jewish community. There are plenty of communities where, in faith communities, where you're not dating. Teenagers don't get to date until later. And I think that we need to all be clear that just because you're not allowed to do it, you might still be doing it. And that's something for parents of Jewish teenagers to be aware of, just like parents of Catholic teenagers might need to be aware that I remember working with a Catholic educator who said, well, I want you to talk about sexual violence, and I want you to talk about that consent, because these teens, they're not supposed to be having sex, but they might be having sex. And if they are having sex, or even if they're not supposed to be, they're not planning to have sex, but there's rape or something, we want these people to be able to come and talk to us. And that's the same thing with this, in this situation. We want our faith communities to be spaces where they understand. Maybe they don't want their teens to be dating, but they know that it might happen. And what are they going to do? We want to be a place where we want faith communities, all faith communities, to be a place where you can come and talk about what's happening to you. Okay. I did want to go back to Jewish survivors will rarely go to shelter. They will more likely go to a friend's house, which is not always safe. And it doesn't mean that Jewish survivors won't go to shelter, but it's more rare. I think that there are some wonderful Jewish agencies. Hadassah.org offers resources. Jewish Women International, those are both national, but there are also some more local. If you're in the Boston area, Journey to Safety, our friends at Journey to Safety offer support. And just because you won't go to shelter doesn't mean that, you all know this, that doesn't mean that you don't want support. A lot of times Jewish survivors think they have to leave, or any survivor thinks that the only way to get services is to leave. That is not the case. So we want to make sure people know that there is support for them without having to go to shelter. And I just mentioned Jewish Women International. Another place to reach out to is Faith Trust Institute. They have resources, and the Boston Aguna Task Force is a national get I mentioned earlier. If you know someone who is having trouble getting a get, they could be a great resource for you. Now, I guess I'm going to open it up to any questions. I guess that didn't take as long as I expected, but I would be happy to hear from people if you have questions. I'm looking here. Okay. Predominant narrative for Jewish people. Are Jewish people socialized as white? There are Jewish people who aren't socialized as white, but have been brought up. Okay. I thank you for that. And I think it's not just, I think about not just Jewish, when I think specifically, when I think of the young families that were in my congregation when I was growing up, who adopted children, whether they were Asian children or Black children or Latina children. And they were Jewish first. I think I can't really speak to that problem, but it is much easier, as someone said earlier, to hide your Jewishness. But if your Jewishness is a bigger part of you than the color of your skin, that will be that's another place where advocates can try and figure out where those people can get their support. I think that's really what it comes down to, is what support systems are helping you, whether you're a person of color or whether you're a person of faith.
You've got another question here, Allison.
Yes.
What are some suggestions for shelters and what they can do to make it a more appropriate setting?
Oh, thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question. And actually, I do have some experience with that, because when I first started working at Safe Havens, we talked about, we were trying to work with a shelter to help them be more to help them be kosher. But I think that if you have a Jewish person who is in your shelter who wants to keep kosher, things are so much different than they were 20 years ago when I started working with Anne Marie and we were working on this idea of a kosher kitchen for a particular shelter. There are lots of ways. There are so many different meals, so many more different options. I think that one thing that people can do is if the person is very interested in keeping strictly kosher, then having a separate refrigerator with food that they can stock themselves. There are lots of foods that everyone can eat, and a lot of people who keep kosher are willing to be vegetarian, but they don't want to eat pork. They won't want to eat shellfish. So maybe those things are you don't serve in your shelter. But I think really what it comes down to is just being open and talking to the person about it. How can we help you maintain your observance? I don't think that anyone expects to be that anyone expects the whole world to stop so they can keep kosher. Just like I don't think anyone expects the whole world to stop for other needs when they're in a situation. You want to be able to support them as best you can, and sometimes there'll be compromises that have to be made. But if you do have those issues, you can reach out to Safe Havens we can talk through a specific situation. We can connect you with rabbis who have worked with us, who understand abuse, and who will suggest to the person who is in that situation, you need to do what you have. You need to save your life. You need to, make sure that whatever you do is maintaining. Forget I said that. That I didn't say it the right way. But we can support you as you try and walk that journey to support people in your community, in your shelter community who have faith-based needs. Anything else?
I was just going to mention that Jewish survivors, as well as survivors from other, especially minority religious communities, I've heard from several saying, well, I didn't really want to disclose my faith to the shelter provider because in the survivor's eyes, it made them more complicated as a client. And so they would hide their faith or their dietary needs or whatever it was, because this is not the only religious community that has dietary laws. But just feel that they feel as though I'm just quoting what survivors have said to me. They feel like there's so much competition for shelter beds. At least here in the Boston area, the shelters are typically always full. And I've had a couple of survivors say, well, I just assumed they would rather have an easier client than me who comes in with dietary laws or me who comes in with particular needs. And I just really took that to heart when I heard it. It's kind of a sad thing for survivors to be saying, but also how is that message getting out there and how can we counter that message? So this about how to make a shelter more appropriate for a Jewish survivor is exactly where we want to go in terms of saying, we'll within reason, we'll do what we can to accommodate your needs. I think Alice was saying that any rabbi will say that if it's a matter of life and death, that you should eat food that's not kosher, or you should, that saving your own life is the highest value.
Yes.
However, we also argue that if we can help faith-based survivors can remain connected to their faith community or their traditions or their observances while they're in the shelter, it's one more way to help support their identity, which so much has been ripped away from them, right? Their core values, who they feel they are. I mean, it's a real grounding, faith is a very grounding observance usually. And so if we can help people stay connected to that in any way, it can really help people stay connected to their strengths and their resources? I love this question because it's just like, what could we do to help you be more confident and comfortable here in our space or in this space?
And I think, again, as Anne Marie was saying, people who are Jewish are not the only ones who have dietary laws, but it's also not just about dietary laws. There are just so many ways that we can be culturally responsive. And I think I started out talking about this, and I guess it's appropriate to finish with this. There are, you don't have to be the expert. There are books, there are resources, there's Safe Havens, there's Jewish Women International, there's Faith Trust, there's Boston Aguna Task Force, there is, if you're in the Boston area, Journey to Safety. Lots of places can help you understand if you have those needs. And I can't imagine that there would be any person experiencing abuse who would say, if you said, I want to help you be more comfortable, I want to help you get the support you need, but I'm not sure, I want to reach out and get some information from these agencies, I would imagine that the advocate would be most grateful to be heard for her whole being or his whole being. And that reminds me, you know, we talk about, I've been talking about women only, but there are Jewish men who are abused, and sometimes the stereotypes play right into that. The pushy woman, the pushy Jewish woman who's loud and demanding and never pleased. Sometimes that is the case, and the male in the situation is the person who's experiencing the abuse. So I go back to that. Thank you all. I think I want to point out that we do have a couple of upcoming webinars on June 9th on supporting GLBTQ plus survivors of faith, and on June 24th, supporting African American survivors of faith. Those promise to be excellent because we have awesome, one of our board members, Dr. Nancy Nienhaus, will be presenting on June 9th, and Ayana Wallace from Ujima will be presenting on June 24th. If you have any questions or would like to reach out to us, our email addresses are here. Don't hesitate to reach out with questions, comments. There will be an evaluation popping up shortly. We would greatly appreciate it if you would answer that. And I thank you all so much for your time. If there are no last questions, I think that
Allison, I just put one in the chat box for you from the Q&A box.
Oh.
It says your experience is only with Jewish people of color who were adopted by white Jewish people and not Jewish people of color brought up in Jewish culture. Thank you for your patience with my questions.
Yes, well, my limited experience on that, and I did actually, to the person who asked that, if you would like to chat after I sent you my email address, it might be easier to have a conversation because I'm not quite sure what you're getting at. And I think it's important. So I want to make sure I understand. So with that, I will thank you all again for attending and wish you all a good afternoon.
Thank you, Al. That was really helpful. And thank you all for coming.